The rope bit into her wrists, a dull, familiar ache that had become part of the landscape of her body. It was coarse and frayed, just like the hem of her dress, just like the ends of her hair that the wind whipped across her face. Dust, fine as ground bone, settled in the creases of her eyes and the cracks of her lips. She did not blink. She did not taste it. She had learned to make a home of stillness, a fortress of emptiness. She was tied to the porch post of the general store, a piece of unwanted freight left for public viewing. The town of Redemption was little more than a smudge of wood and dirt under a vast, unforgiving sky, and its people moved around her like water around a stone. Some stared, their eyes flat with pity or curiosity. Others spat, a dark punctuation mark on the thirsty ground near her bare feet. Most, after a first glance, simply looked away, their indifference a heavier weight than any open scorn. He'd left her there. The man whose name she had tried to forget, whose touch was a geography of bruises. He had called it a lesson. He had called her worthless. He had laughed, a sound like dry things breaking, before mounting his horse and riding east, leaving her tethered like an animal. The sun climbed the sky, a merciless white eye. The shadows of the townsfolk stretched and shrank and stretched again. Laughter from the saloon across the street drifted over, thin and sharp. A dog barked. A hammer fell. The world went on, and she remained at its still center, a monument to a private shame made public. She watched the dust devils dance at the edge of town, spinning themselves into being and then into nothing. They were the only things that moved with any real purpose. Then, through the haze of heat and resignation, another figure separated from the landscape. He came not from the saloon or the store, but from the far end of the street, leading a pack mule laden with canvas-wrapped supplies. He moved with a slow, deliberate gait that spoke of long distances and heavy thoughts. He was a tall man, thin as a fence rail inside a dusty, worn duster that hung from his shoulders like a second skin. His hat was pulled low, casting his face in shadow, but she saw the gray in his beard, etched there like frost on a winter windowpane. He did not look at her at first. His focus was on tying his mule to the rail a few posts down from where she stood. His hands, calloused and cracked, moved with an economy of motion, knotting the rope with a practiced flick of the wrist. Only when his animal was secure did his gaze lift. It was not a stare, not a gawk. It was a slow, steady appraisal that took in the rope, the raw skin of her wrists, the stark set of her jaw. His eyes, when they finally met hers, were the color of a winter sky just before a storm. They held no judgment, no pity, not even anger. They held a kind of weary recognition, as if he were looking at a familiar sorrow. He carried whole winters in his eyes. She held his gaze for a breath, too, then her own fell back to the dust. A flicker of something, shame, maybe, or a ghost of defiance, tightened her throat. She expected him to move on, to enter the store and leave her to her slow dissolution. He did not. He stood there, a silent sentinel in the harsh afternoon light, his shadow falling long and cool over her feet. The noise of the town seemed to recede, leaving only the sound of the wind sighing through the eaves of the building. It was a waiting kind of silence, an open silence, and it was more unsettling than the noise had been. Just then, the man who had left her there, Sterling, emerged from the saloon, wiping his mouth with the back of his hand. He was a man whose softness was a kind of cruelty, his face fleshy and his eyes small and mean. He saw the tall man looking at her and swaggered over, a smirk playing on his lips. "Find something to your liking, Thorne?" Sterling's voice was slick with false bonhomie. "Bit used, I'm afraid. Damaged goods." The tall man, Thorne, did not look at Sterling. His gaze remained fixed somewhere in the middle distance on the heat shimmering above the plains. His silence was a wall. "Figured I'd leave her for the crows," Sterling continued, enjoying his audience of two. "Teach her a lesson about gratitude." Thorne finally turned his head, a slow, deliberate movement. His voice, when it came, was low and raspy, like stones grinding together at the bottom of a dry creek bed. "You still owe me for those 2 geldings." Sterling blinked, thrown by the sudden shift. "What's that got to do with anything?" "Consider the debt paid," Thorne said. He took 2 steps forward, his boots scuffing softly in the dirt. He reached into his coat and pulled out a small, worn pocket knife. A tremor went through her, a current of pure, cold fear. She flinched back against the post that was digging into her spine. Her eyes squeezed shut, bracing for the sharp, familiar sting of a blade. But the cut, when it came, was not on her skin. It was the soft, parting sound of rope fibers giving way. Once, then twice. The pressure on her wrists vanished. The ropes fell away, coiling in the dust at her feet like dead snakes. She did not move. Her hands remained frozen in front of her, ghost-cuffed. She opened her eyes. Thorn was folding the knife, his expression unreadable. He slid it back into his pocket. He had not touched her. He had not even come close enough for her to feel his warmth. Sterling stared, his mouth agape. Now hold on. You can't just. I just did, Thorn said, his voice flat and final. He gestured with his chin toward the woman. She's mine now. By your own reckoning, he turned his back on Sterling, a dismissal more profound than any insult. He looked at her, his gaze steady. Come on. It was not a command. It was a statement of fact, as plain and solid as the ground beneath them. She stared at him, at this stranger who had bought her freedom with a forgotten debt. Her legs felt rooted to the spot, tangled in the invisible ropes of fear and habit. But his eyes held hers, and in their gray depths she saw not a new owner but an escape. A narrow, dark passage leading away from this place. Slowly, cautiously, as if testing the strength of a frozen river, she lowered her hands. She took one step, then another. The dust was hot beneath her bare feet. She followed him toward the mule, a silent shadow trailing a silent man, leaving the town and the life she'd known to dissolve behind her like a bad dream at sunrise. The journey was a long stretch of quiet. Thorn untied his mule, loaded the last of his supplies, and swung himself onto the saddle of a horse she hadn't noticed before, a lean, gray mare that matched its rider in temperament. He didn't offer her a ride, and she didn't expect one. He simply started walking the horse, and she fell into step behind the mule. The sun beat down. The land stretched out on all sides, a tapestry of brown and ochre under a pale blue sky. Dust lifted behind them like ghosts of their own making. For the first hour, the silence was heavy, thick with the unspoken events of the town. But as redemption shrank to a speck and then vanished entirely, the quiet began to change. It became less of an absence and more of a presence. It was the sound of the wind brushing against sage, the creak of saddle leather, the soft thud of hooves and feet on the hard-packed earth. She kept her eyes on the mule's swaying tail, a hypnotic rhythm that emptied her mind. Her wrists throbbed with the memory of the ropes, a phantom pain. Once Thorn stopped. He dismounted and unhooked a canteen from his saddle. He drank, then held it out to her. She hesitated, her gaze flickering to his face and then away. He simply held it there, patient, his arm outstretched. She took it. Her fingers, clumsy and trembling slightly, brushed against his. The metal was cool against her palm. She drank, the water tasting of tin and dust and a kindness so profound it almost made her weep. She had not been offered water without a price in a lifetime. She drank until her thirst was gone, then screwed the cap back on and handed it back to him. Their fingers did not touch this time. He said nothing, just hooked it back onto his saddle and they moved on. Dusk was painting the sky in bruised colors of violet and blood orange when they finally saw it. A small homestead nestled in a shallow valley, sheltered by a low bluff. It was a simple cabin, built of weathered timber that had gone gray with sun and snow. A stone chimney stood at one end, and a porch ran the length of the front. A short distance away, a barn leaned slightly, as if tired. The place looked as solitary and worn as the man who led her to it. There was a single grave on the hill overlooking the cabin, marked with a simple wooden cross. She saw it as they approached, a stark silhouette against the fading light. The sight of it sent a cold sliver of understanding through her. This was a place of loss. A place where silence had long ago made its home. Thorn led the animals to the barn. He did not tell her what to do, so she stood by the porch, wrapping her thin arms around herself as the evening chill began to settle. The air smelled of pine and cold stone. The land itself seemed to be holding its breath. He emerged from the barn after a few minutes, his duster gone, revealing a simple homespun shirt. He walked onto the porch and pushed open the cabin door. It creaked. Light from the dying sun spilled into a dark, simple room. You can sleep in there, he said, his voice low. He pointed to a small door off the main room. Food's on the table when you're ready. He walked past her to a woodpile and began splitting kindling for a fire, the rhythmic thwack of the axe the only sound in the growing twilight. She watched him for a moment, his movements spare and efficient. Then she turned and stepped over the threshold into the cabin. The main room was one space, dominated by a large stone fireplace, a rough-hewn table with 2 chairs, and a narrow cot in the far corner. It was clean but bare, stripped of any softness. On the table sat half a loaf of bread, a wedge of cheese, and a dried apple. It was more food than she'd seen in one place for herself in months. She looked toward the door he had indicated. Peering inside, she saw a small, stark room. It held nothing but a narrow bed with a patch quilt folded neatly at its foot. There was a small window, covered not with glass but with a stretched piece of oiled hide, letting in a muted, golden light. There was a hook on the back of the door, but no lock. She backed out and stood in the center of the main room, listening to the steady chop of the axe outside. He was not locking her in. He was offering her food. He was giving her a room of her own. This was the unspoken contract, laid out not in words but in bread and an unlocked door. A deep, shuddering breath escaped her, a sound she hadn't realized she was holding. It felt like the first crack in a long, frozen winter. The days that followed fell into a rhythm as quiet and steady as a slow heartbeat. They moved around each other in the small space of the homestead, two solitary planets held in a strange, silent orbit. Their lives were stitched together not with words but with raw thread of shared work. He rose before the sun, his movements quiet as he started the fire in the hearth. The smell of wood smoke and coffee would drift into her small room, pulling her from a shallow, restless sleep. By the time she emerged, he would be gone, out to the barn or the far pastures. A mug of coffee would be waiting for her on the table, black and strong. She would drink it, feeling the warmth spread through her. A small, daily kindness that felt like an anchor. Section she found her place in the quiet order of things. She swept the floor of the cabin, the soft whisk of the broom a comforting sound. She collected eggs from the 3 nervous hens that scratched in the dirt behind the cabin. She learned to work the hand pump for water, the squeal of the handle and the splash into the bucket becoming part of her daily music. She watched him work. He moved with a relentless, tireless energy, as if he were trying to outrun a memory that was always at his heels. He mended fences, his hammer blows echoing across the valley. He cleared stones from a small plot of land near the house, his back a long, straight line of strain. He never asked for her help, but one afternoon as he wrestled with a heavy fence post, she walked over, picked up the sledgehammer he had set aside, and held it ready. He looked at her, a flicker of surprise in his tired eyes, then nodded. He held the post and she swung the hammer. It was clumsy at first, but she found the rhythm, the weight of it feeling solid and real in her hands. They worked together, the only sounds the grunts of effort and the percussive ring of iron on wood. They ate their meals in silence. The food was simple: stew, bread, beans. Sometimes he would hunt and they would have rabbit or grouse. She took over the cooking, finding a strange solace in the methodical process of chopping vegetables and stirring a pot. She learned to bake bread in the hearth oven. Her first loaf was a disaster, dense and hard as a river stone. She had set it on the table between them, her cheeks burning with shame. He had picked it up, turned it over in his large hands, and wrapped it on the table. It made a solid clunk. He looked at her, a faint crinkle at the corners of his eyes. "That loaf died in vain," he said, his voice utterly serious. Then he took his knife, sawed off a piece with great effort and chewed it thoughtfully. "Little dry." She had stared at him, and for the first time since she had arrived, a small, rusty smile touched her lips. "You didn't complain about mine," she'd heard herself say, her own voice a shock, thin and unused. He had simply grunted and sawed off another piece. The tension had broken, just for a moment, leaving something warmer and lighter in its place. One afternoon, while he was out on the range, she found herself drawn to the grave on the hill. She walked up the gentle slope, the wind pressing her dress against her legs. The cross was weathered, the name carved into it almost illegible. "Sarah." She traced the letters with her finger. She thought of the woman who had lived in this house, who had slept in that bed, who had perhaps planted the stubborn, wilting rosebush near the porch. She knelt and began to pull the weeds that grew thick around the base of the grave. Her hands were gentle, her movements careful. When she was done, she walked down to the creek bed and found a single, bright yellow wildflower growing stubbornly between 2 rocks. She picked it and brought it back, tucking the stem into the earth at the foot of the cross. It was a small, bright flag of life in a place of quiet sorrow. When Thorne returned at sunset, he rode past the hill as he always did. She watched from the porch as he reined in his horse. He sat there for a long time, looking at the small splash of yellow against the brown earth. He didn't look toward the cabin. He just sat, silhouetted against the deepening sky. When he finally rode down to the barn, she had already gone inside, the unspoken acknowledgement hanging in the air between them. The nights were the hardest. The silence of the cabin would press in, and the memories would come, sharp and cruel as broken glass. One night, a dream took her, a suffocating thing of ropes and laughter and Sterling's fleshy face. She woke with a strangled cry, sitting bolt upright in her narrow bed, her heart hammering against her ribs like a trapped bird. The room was pitch black, and for a terrifying moment, she thought she was locked in. Panic seized her. She scrambled out of bed, her breath coming in ragged gasps, and fumbled for the door. Her hand found the smooth wood, the latch. It gave way easily. She stumbled out into the main room, lit only by the faint, dying glow of embers in the hearth. Thorn was there. He wasn't on his cot. He was sitting in one of the chairs by the table, a rifle laid across his lap, facing the front door. He wasn't asleep. He was simply sitting watch. He turned his head as she appeared. He didn't speak. He just looked at her, his face carved from shadow and faint red light. The panic in her chest slowly subsided, replaced by a profound and overwhelming sense of safety. He had been sitting there all along. Every night. She stood there, trembling in her thin shift. He watched her for a long moment. "Go back to bed," he said, his voice gentle. "You're safe here." She wanted to say something, to ask why. "Why did you take me? Why are you kind?" The questions were a knot in her throat. Instead, she found herself asking the one thing that felt solid. "The door," she whispered, her voice barely a sound. "You don't lock it." His gaze shifted to the fireplace. "My wife. Sarah." She was afraid of locked doors. Hated them. He was quiet for a moment, lost in a memory she couldn't see. "I don't lock doors." It was the most he had ever told her about himself. A piece of his past offered up in the dark like a fragile gift. She nodded, a small, jerky movement. She turned and walked back to her room, leaving the door ajar. She lay down in her bed, but she did not sleep. She listened to the soft sounds of his presence in the other room, a steady, breathing wall against the darkness of the world, and felt the ice around her heart begin to thaw. The first sign of trouble was a smudge of dust on the eastern horizon. It was a week later, on a morning so clear and bright it felt like a lie. She was hanging laundry on a line stretched between the cabin and a lone pine tree, the damp cloth cool in her hands, the scent of lye soap clean in the air. Thorn was in the barn, the sound of his hammer ringing sharp and clear. She saw the dust first. A faint, rising plume against the blue, too deliberate for a wind devil. Her hands stilled. Her heart gave a hard, painful lurch. She had seen dust like that before. It was the dust of riders. She dropped the clothespins into her apron pocket and walked quickly to the barn. The hammer blows stopped as she appeared in the wide doorway, her shadow falling across the sunlit floor. Thorn looked up from the harness he was mending. He saw her face and his own expression hardened. He didn't need to ask. He simply set down his tools, wiped his hands on his trousers, and walked to the doorway to look for himself. "Go inside," he said, his voice flat. "Stay away from the window." She hesitated, her feet refusing to move. The thought of being inside, of waiting behind a wall while the danger came closer, was unbearable. "Go," he repeated, his voice sharper this time, but his eyes held a plea, not a command. She turned and walked back to the cabin, her legs stiff. She did as he asked, moving away from the single front window and standing near the hearth, where the heavy iron poker rested on its stand. Her hand found its cold, solid weight. She didn't lift it. Not yet. She just rested her fingers on it, drawing a strange strength from the feel of it. Through the gaps in the chinking, she watched Thorn. He didn't go for his rifle. He simply walked to the center of the yard, in the open space between the cabin and the road, and waited. He stood there, his feet planted, his hands loose at his sides, a solitary, unmovable object against the vast landscape. The dust cloud grew, resolving itself into 3 riders. They slowed as they approached the homestead, their horses kicking up small puffs of dirt. She recognized the man in the lead instantly. Sterling. His bulk seemed to spill over his expensive saddle. The 2 men with him were hired guns, their faces hard and impassive. They reined in their horses a dozen yards from where Thorn stood. The air grew thick with a tension that felt electric. "Thorn," Sterling called out, his voice carrying an oily confidence. "I've come for my property." Thorn didn't answer. He just stood there watching them. His stillness was more powerful than any shouted threat. "I was feeling generous that day," Sterling continued, patting his horse's neck. "Let you have your little charity case. But I've had a change of heart. A deal's a deal, but she belongs to me. Legally. She's not property," Thorn said, his voice quiet but carrying clearly in the still air. "And she's not yours." Sterling laughed, a short, ugly sound. "Is that so? Last I checked, a man has a right to what's his. I've got papers. A contract." He patted a pocket on his coat. "All legal and binding." "Your papers don't mean much out here," Thorn said. "This is my land. She's under my protection." "Protection?" Sterling sneered. "Are you her husband now, Thorn? Took my leavings for a wife?" He looked toward the cabin, his eyes squinting. "Come on out, girl. Don't you want to come back to a real man? One who can give you more than this dirt patch. Inside the cabin, her blood went cold, then hot. The old fear was there, a shivering thing in the pit of her stomach. But something else rose to meet it. A hot, bright spike of rage. He was not talking to her. He was talking to an object, a thing he thought he owned. The woman he had tied to a post would have cowered. She would have prayed for the floor to swallow her. But she was not that woman anymore. Her fingers tightened around the fire poker. She lifted it. It was heavy balanced. She took a breath, the air tasting of wood smoke and dust and a fury she hadn't known she possessed. She walked to the cabin door, her steps measured and silent. Outside, one of Sterling's men was dismounting, a coiled rope in his hand. We can do this easy, or we can do this hard, Thorn. Thorn took a small step to his left, positioning himself more squarely in front of the cabin door. You're not setting foot on this porch. It was then that the cabin door creaked open. All four men turned. She stood there, framed in the doorway, the dark interior of the cabin behind her. She held the iron poker in both hands, its tip pointed toward the ground. Her hair was loose, blowing in the wind. Her face was pale, but her eyes were burning. She didn't look at Thorn. She looked directly at Sterling. A silence fell, thicker and more profound than before. Sterling stared, his smirk faltering. This was not the broken, silent creature he had left in town. This was someone else entirely. Thorn saw her, and something shifted in his stance. Attention left his shoulders, replaced by a kind of solid pride. He did not look surprised. He looked affirmed. See, Sterling recovered, his voice regaining its bluster. She's waiting, knows where she belongs, he made to dismount. She took one step forward onto the porch. She raised the poker until it was level, pointed directly at Sterling's chest. Her knuckles were white. Her voice, when she spoke, was not the whisper he remembered. It was clear, steady, and full of jagged edges. No! The word hung in the air, small but immense. It was a shield. It was a sword. It was the sound of a lock breaking. Sterling froze 1 foot out of the stirrup, his face mottled with shock and rage. You ungrateful! You heard her. Thorn's voice cut in, low and dangerous. She said no. Now get off my land before you find out what hospitality really means out here. He still hadn't moved toward a weapon, but the threat in his voice was as real as a drawn pistol. Sterling looked from her defiant face to Thorn's unyielding one. He saw the two of them standing together, a united front. He saw the woman holding the poker not with fear, but with intent. He saw the cold promise in Thorn's eyes. He looked at his 2 hired men who were now glancing at each other, their enthusiasm for the job rapidly draining away. This wasn't a simple reclamation anymore. This was a fight, and Thorn's kind of fight was the kind you didn't always walk away from. He spat on the ground, a gesture of impotent fury. Keep her, he snarled, yanking his foot back into the stirrup. You deserve each other. 2 broken things in a broken-down shack. He wheeled his horse around so sharply that it whinnied in protest and dug his heels in. His men, looking relieved, followed suit. They rode away, their retreat kicking up the same dust their arrival had. She and Thorn stood there, not moving, until the riders were once again just a smudge on the horizon and then nothing at all. The silence that rushed back in to fill the space was clean. The poker in her hands suddenly felt immensely heavy. Her arms trembled, and she lowered it, its iron tip clanging softly against the wooden porch. Thorn turned to look at her. His face was still grim, but the storm in his eyes had passed, leaving behind a sky that was clear and quiet. He took in the sight of her, standing on his porch, holding a weapon to defend his home. To defend herself. I was scared, she said, the words coming out on a shaky breath. He took a step closer, stopping at the edge of the porch below her. He looked up at her, and for the first time she saw something in his face that was not sorrow or duty. It was a kind of wondering awe. I know, he said softly. You didn't run. She shook her head, a small movement. This is my home. The words hung in the air between them, true and solid as the earth beneath their feet. He held her gaze for a long moment, and in that shared look, 1,000 unspoken things were said. A new contract was signed, not of safety and shelter, but of something deeper, something forged in a crucible of shared defiance. The house, which had been his shelter and her sanctuary, had finally become their fortress. After the dust settled and the threat was gone, a new kind of quiet took root in the small valley. It wasn't the silence of isolation anymore, but the rich, warm quiet of shared space, of mutual understanding. That evening, as she prepared their meal, her movements felt different. They were her own. The cabin felt like it was breathing around her, its wooden walls imbued with the strength of her stand. They ate at the rough table, the fire crackling in the hearth. The food was the same, stew and fresh bread, but it tasted richer. The air between them was charged, not with tension, but with the aftermath of a storm that had cleared the air. He watched her across the table, his gaze thoughtful. "I never asked," he said, his voice low. "Your name." She looked down at her hands, resting in her lap. The name she'd been called by Sterling felt like a brand, a word that belonged to the woman tied to the post. It wasn't hers. Not anymore. She had no other. She slowly shook her head. He nodded as if he understood. He looked at her, at the way the firelight caught the strands of her hair, at the newfound steadiness in her eyes. "You look like Alina," he said. It wasn't a declaration or a command. It was an offering, a question. Lena. The name felt strange and new on her tongue, even in her thoughts. It was clean. It had no history. It was a seed. She looked up at him, and for the first time, she gave him a true, unguarded smile. It felt like stretching a muscle that hadn't been used in years. She nodded. Lena. The next day, she gathered the ragged, dirt-stained dress she had arrived in. It was a relic of another life, a skin she had shed. She carried it to the hearth where Elias, she had learned his name was Elias, was sitting, cleaning his rifle. She held it up for a moment. Then, without ceremony, she tossed it into the flames. They watched together as the fire consumed it. The cloth blackened, curled, and flared into a bright, consuming orange before collapsing into a whisper of gray ash. The fire only changes everything if something new is waiting in the ash. Elias reached out then, not to touch her, but to lay a hand on the worn blanket beside her, a gesture of silent communion. Their life fell into a new, deeper rhythm. The work was the same, but it was done with a shared purpose. They rebuilt the section of fence Sterling's horses had trampled, working side by side. He taught her how to sight a rifle, her hands steady on the cool wood and metal. She planted a small garden in the plot of land he had cleared, coaxing green shoots from the stubborn soil. She hung a simple curtain over the window in the main room, a small touch of softness that changed the light. The house began to breathe again. One evening they sat on the porch, watching the stars prick the vast, dark canvas of the sky. The air was cool and smelled of pine. "You're either the kindest man I've ever met," Lena said softly, not looking at him, "or the most foolish." Elias was silent for a long time, tracing the rim of his coffee mug with his thumb. "Can't I be both?" he asked, a hint of dry humor in his voice. She smiled into the darkness. They sat there for hours, not needing to speak, simply sharing the immense quiet of the night. It was a home built not of wood and stone, but of small kindnesses, of shared work, of a single word spoken in defiance. It was a life stitched together with raw thread, but the seams were strong. They were strong enough to hold. The seasons turned. The harsh sun of summer gave way to the crisp, golden light of autumn. The first snows dusted the high peaks, a promise of the coming winter. The little homestead was ready. The barn was full of hay, the pantry stocked with preserves from Lena's garden, and the woodpile was high. One afternoon, Elias came in from the cold, stamping the snow from his boots. Lena was by the fire, mending one of his shirts, her needle moving in a steady, practiced rhythm. The light from the hearth illuminated her face, catching the peaceful set of her mouth, the quiet strength in her eyes. He stopped and watched her, this woman who had drifted into his life like a piece of storm-tossed wreckage and had become its anchor. A glance had not told him she was his future. An auction, a debt, an act of defiance had. But now, looking at her, he knew it was true. This was his home. She was his family. He crossed the room and knelt by her chair. He took the needle and thread from her surprised fingers and set them aside. Then he took her hands in his own. They were no longer the hands of a victim, they were strong, capable, calloused from work and warm from the fire. "Lena," he said, his voice rough with an emotion he rarely showed. He didn't have the words for what he felt, not the pretty ones. But he had this. He had the truth. "I would be honored if you would be my wife." She looked at him, her eyes searching his. She saw no pity there, no duty. She saw the quiet, steady love of a man who had seen her at her most broken and had not looked away. She saw a partner. She saw a future. Her answer was not a word. She simply lifted one of her hands and gently touched the weathered lines of his face. It was all the promise he needed. They sat there by the fire as the snow fell outside, blanketing the world in a clean, quiet white. The little cabin was a single point of warm, golden light against the vastness, no longer a place of sorrow or refuge, but a home, finally and completely alive. The land was still harsh, the winters still long, but inside, two broken people had found a way to piece each other back together, creating a life more resilient and beautiful than either could have imagined alone. This story, it isn't just about a rescue on a dusty street. It's about the quiet courage it takes to accept a kindness when you've only ever known cruelty. It's about understanding that a home is not four walls, but the person who sits watch for you in the dark. So much of a life is about a naming. We are named by our parents, by our lovers, by our enemies. We are branded by our failures and defined by our scars. But the most important naming is the one we do for ourselves. It is the moment we look at the wreckage of what we were and we toss the old rags into the fire. It is the moment we choose a new name, a new path, even if it's just a single word spoken in defiance on a lonely porch. And sometimes, if you are very lucky, you will find another soul who sees you not for the name the world has given you, but for the one you are fighting to become. They won't fix you. People can't be fixed like broken tools. But they will stand with you. They will offer you their silence, their strength, their bread. They will give you the space to heal yourself. So here's your naming. It's in the quiet acts of decency that go unseen. It's in the choice to be gentle in a world that is hard. It is in the profound bravery of starting over. And if you're brave enough to build a home in the wilderness of your own heart, you might just find you are no longer building it alone. You might find that the person standing beside you, watching the snow fall, is all the future you will ever need.